happy to have with us this evening Marty Levine, who is a member of the coordinating committee of Jewish Voice for Peace in Chicago, which is a chapter of the National Organization of Jewish Voice for Peace. Marty's actually retired CEO of the Jewish Community Centers of Chicago, and he's worked basically his whole lifetime to build a Jewish community in Chicago. So we're very happy, and thank you, Marty, for being here with us this evening. I was wondering if you could start by telling us, though, a bit more about your work in the Jewish community and your role with Jewish Voice for Peace.
Thank you for inviting me, and I'm very happy to spend some time this evening both talking about myself and about JVP, and most critically about what is a very difficult moment in the life of our Palestinian brothers. Let me start by reversing the order of this. How do I come to be here? I left graduate school a heck of a long time at Columbia University Social Work School, and went to work for a series of Jewish community center organizations across the country, ending up a little more than 40 years ago in Chicago. And if you're not familiar, JCCs are to some extent like YM and YWCAs, but have a very large focus on building a modern Jewish community that helps people blend their religious values into how they live day to day, moment to moment, week to week, year to year. And that consumed me for a heck of a long part of my life. Part of that work began to engage with figuring out how does Israel connect to life in the United States for Jews, and took me on a almost uncountable number of trips with members of my community in and out of Israel. And those trips began very ideally with a sense of, gee, this land in Israel had so much of my history going back thousands of years. Almost every foot I stepped once entering the land had a moment from that history. Ruins, stories, tales, moments of religious importance. And then over the course of each of those visits, something really disturbing began to make that idyllic reality change. And that reality was looking at what was life for the folks living there who were not Jewish, particularly for those people who were Palestinians. And the more I explored that country, the more I came face to face with what you're organizationally beginning to embrace, which is the question of what does apartheid look like when you confront it. And I want to just share two moments before I talk about JVP and why it became my work. One moment, actually, on a trip in which I took my three children along with my wife and I, looking out over what the Israeli government tends to euphemistically call the separation fence, which divided Palestinian land from Israeli territory. And standing on top of a hill looking at that, in front of me was an olive tree. Then there was this wall, and it wasn't a fence, it was a wall. And beyond that were some farmhouses. And those farmhouses were the owners, the Palestinian owners of that of those olive trees. And the reality was that Israel had built a wall, which meant those people could not go and tend their gardens, their trees, their economic future, because there was no way to get from that farm for that Palestinian to those lands. And one began to question, what was that about? Somewhat later, I was driving on a road that years before I had easily driven out of Jerusalem, headed east toward the city of Jericho. And that road had crossed countryside, which had Bedouin villages, Palestinian villages, some refugee camps, but the road was open. And now on this trip later, I ran smack into that same wall. And inquiring about it, that wall had been built so that Palestinians and a Palestinian nation could not connect back into Jerusalem. And it was just a dead end wall. And moment by moment, I, as a Jew who entered Israel very comfortably and easily, began to confront the fact that in my name was being built a real separation. And year by year, trip by trip, that separation got more and more drastic and became more and more brutal. And from my perspective, as a Jewish communal worker, as someone who was interested in building a Jewish community, I could not reconcile some of the basic tenets of our faith, of our community. One, that every one of us was created in the image of God, and each one of us was created and therefore equally. And yet, in the name of Jewish security, another group of people who had deep roots in that land was being separated. And I could no longer affirm that that nation was actually speaking in my name or in my vision as a Jew. And so as I returned and began to look at what I want to do about that, Jewish Voice for Peace became one of the few Jewish organizations which was willing to speak out in the name of not only Judaism, but was willing to speak out in the name of the Palestinian people. And so I joined and became more and more deeply involved in an organization whose core vision is one that we live in a world where all people from the United States to Palestine are really deserving and must live in freedom, justice, equality, and in equal dignity. And that as an organization, we're committed to fight for the liberation of all people. So JVP therefore believes that through the work we do, through organizing, we can and will dismantle the institutions and structures that sustain this injustice and grow something new, something that's joyful, beautiful, life-sustaining, and affirming of the values that I look at as the values of the Jewish community and the religion that I practice. And I found an organization and partners in this work that committed to be accountable not only to Jewish traditions, but to Palestinian partners. One that is committed to building a Jewish community that's not focused on building a nation that is exclusionary and sees Jewishness as something above and beyond the rights and commitments to all its residents. And so we are committed to striving to build a Judaism and Jewish communities that represent a place for all Jewish cultures and will protect the safety of the Jewish community going forward. And is also committed to an overall vision of racial justice and collective liberation. And that's what Jewish Voice for Peace stands for, what we're working for, and what I'm very committed to in this part of my life and in the work I do as a leader of the organization. I hope, Mark, that gives you some grounding of who I am and who I speak for.
Yes, it really does. Thank you for the whole group tonight. I think we learned a lot about what led you to where you're at and what Jewish Voice for Peace does. And just one thing that really struck me was the commonality when you shared from the core beliefs or values that there's that of God is in everyone, which is one of our core beliefs as Quakers that we share, and then equality that you shared, which is also for us an important testimony. So I was, And stemming forth from that is, you know, our American Friends Service Committee implemented the Apartheid Free Initiative, which we shared with you, and the pledge in support of Palestinian freedom from oppression. And right now, we're trying to support this campaign at our local Quaker meetings. And our question for you is, what would you want us to know as we engage with this topic with our communities in trying to build unity in our communities on this? What do you think is important for us to know as we bring this forward?
This is I think a really important moment because of what we have witnessed for the last 6 months taking place in front of us. And I think it's important, and I'm going to do a little bit of screen sharing just to put some fact and information in front of us. One, I think it's important to recognize that you are individually and organizationally not alone in coming to the conclusion that what's going on and has been going on in Israel is really captured by the word apartheid. The list I'm sharing from you is not a complete list, and it's about a year old, but every one of these organizations has concluded that what they've seen, what they're experiencing, what you see, read, is in fact an expression of apartheid. And I want to point out that a number of these organizations are in fact on the ground Israeli organizations, and primarily Israeli Jewish or Israeli Jewish Arab organizations. Breaking the Silence, which is an organization of veterans of the Israeli army. Yesh Din and B'Tselem, which are like American Friends, human rights organizations on the ground, the Physicians for Human Rights in Israel, and Kerem Navot, another Israeli-based organization. But I think importantly, perhaps as much as any, both Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, which are organizations whose job it is to look across the globe at issues of discrimination, have come to see the situation as I see it, as one of genocide in the last few months and apartheid in the reality of the conditions. I'd also point out at the moment that while all of our eyes have been for 6 months on Gaza, on what it means to live and watch that, quietly going on in front of us has been a continuation of a picture I want to come back to focus on. The continued displacement of a Palestinian population. So I'm putting in front of you some data, one which looks at the growth of the Jewish community, the Jewish population up through 1948, as the both immigration and then in during the years of which Britain controlled under the Mandate a large piece of land that is now modern Israel, Palestine, and then some maps. This is a look at pre-48, the population in Palestine, breaking out the Jewish population by geographic area, and then moving forward to look at what was in the 1948 land, the state, this orange color, what was to be an independent Arab state, in the yellow color, and this white area being an international Jerusalem. And then we come to look at what occurred over the course of several years in the Oslo Accords, setting out now in the green, a very, very small area that was supposed to be Palestinian, but still under Israeli government control, and the now growing landmass of Israel, led by the state as we now know it. And I want to just point out, because it's in the news to you all, in front of all of our eyes, how small this area is that is Gaza. That's where my arrow is. I want to come back to 2023, before the event, what was left of supposedly a Palestinian state, and you now have a series of very South African-like Bantustans, supposedly in this dark green area of Palestinian governance. And so how could one not conclude that what's left here is a territory that has millions of Palestinian citizens living under Israeli government control in a landmass in which there is no really effective growing land? And to give you a sense of the geography of what emerged, just to throw in front of you some comparative land masses. And I want to end this response with the vision of the current Israeli government. This is a picture of the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, speaking to the United Nations in the last General Assembly. And he, like many government leaders, comes to speak, and he was speaking about the new Middle East with, as you can see in this black area, I'm pointing to a map which includes Israel. And I beg to ask you where this Israeli government views Palestine to be, because it no longer appears even as a reference from the government of Israel's perspective. So this is the reality that an apartheid government is playing forward, and which then gets us to these organizations looking at life conditions, the conditions that I talked about in my own personal journey of confronting, to conclude that that is what is comprised by a range of organizations to be the modern apartheid state of Israel. So that's my response to you as individuals and organizationally. Concluding now is a moment to sign on. I don't know, having grown up in the moments in which many of us confronted South African reality and began to understand the meaning of a word apartheid, how to look at the conditions of life for Palestinians without reaching a similar conclusion to say this is indeed apartheid. It is a state which has a state law which says we are a land for which Palestinian people do not have the same rights as Jewish citizens. It is a conclusion that Human Rights Watch, when it concluded that it was signing on to a conclusion that it is a Palestinian state, an apartheid state, that it is the moment when it had to come to grips. And they concluded, when they did a couple of years ago use the word, that with these words in a report, and I will have a link for you to leave if you want to read the full report, that Israel's apartheid against, a report that was entitled Israel's Apartheid Against Palestinians, a Cruel System of Domination, and a crime against humanity, that Israel had perpetrated the international wrong of apartheid, and almost all of Israel's civilian, administrative, and military authorities, as well as government and quasi-governmental institutions, are involved in the enforcement of the system of apartheid, that the patterns of proscribed acts perpetuated by both Israel, inside Israel, and in the occupied territories form part of a systemic as well as widespread attack directed against the Palestinian population, that Israel has committed the crime against humanity of apartheid under both the Apartheid Convention and the Rome Statute. That's the words of Amnesty International. They are words that were seconded by Israelis. They are the kind of conclusion that B'Tselem, an Israeli human rights organization, concluded about a year before Amnesty International. And their conclusion was that apartheid encountered not just the Palestinians living in the territories and not as occupied peoples, but also applied to the 20% or so of the Israeli citizenry, those living within the state of Israel, who are Palestinian, that they too were living under apartheid conditions. And so, I sort of welcome you aboard and hope that each of you recognizes that individually signing on to this, you are not alone and you're not acting against many in the world of human rights campaigning, but also many Israelis and Israeli Jews who have concluded also they are citizens of a nation, as did many South African citizens ultimately come to conclude that their nation, as it was being governed, not because that was their personal preference, was committing the crime of apartheid.
Thanks so much, Marty, for all of that helpful information. And I know one person, and we can address this later, had even asked if a copy of the presentation could be made available. It really helped put things historically into context and help to understand.
I will leave you the slide materials. They are all available to you, and there are links at the end of it to a number of the source documents.
Thank you very much. And you started to lead into this next question we have, because as we discussed this, some friends have brought up the concern that the pledge, the Apartheid Free Pledge, could be seen as anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish, and wondering, you started to talk about the Israeli Jews, Jewish people that see this as apartheid and are speaking up. But our question was, so how does Jewish Voice for Peace, speak up for the Palestinian liberation and at the same time work to dismantle anti-Semitism if these two things can be done simultaneously, and what advice you'd have to us about this?
Yeah, let me start with, I want to go back here for a moment to this piece from an article that was very recently published in The Nation. Omer Bartov, if you're not familiar, is a scholar, an Israeli-born Jewish scholar currently teaching at Brown University, whose focus is on the Holocaust and on anti-Semitism. And his language repeats something that many of us Jewish Voice for Peace folks who have been in the streets for the last years and very actively over the last 6 months have been trying to say, and it is, never again, which is the watchword of a Jewish community who came out of the Holocaust, something we had a remembrance of just days ago. who came out of that saying, never again, there cannot be in this world a recreation of the experience we as a people experienced at the hands of Nazi Germany. But his words are very focused on never again isn't just about the Jewish people. It is about all people. And he was motivated in this to speak about this in these terms and recognize that anti-Semitism, as many people see it, as JVP sees it, is an argument that singles out Jews as Jews because of who they are. It is a tradition that grew not within the Palestinian world. It grew out of the Jewish experience as exiles in Eastern Europe. It grew historically as a way to play out things that came out very much of Christian thinking about who was responsible for the death of Christ. Interestingly, as this has come, it has become, unfortunately, for forces in the Jewish community, which are very supportive of Israel as it currently lives, who are not, as I am, incredibly upset with the misuse of Judaism as a weapon. And so you have increasingly the attempt to say, if you have a vision that Palestinians and Jews can live in a common world in which we respect our likeness as human beings and respect our differences that come out of culture and religion, that anyone who recognizes that and says that the Israeli government is not speaking in our name, they are using this this hatred of that is representative by anti-Semitism to spark support for Israel. And so JVP is very comfortable that we recognize anti-Semitism as a form of discrimination, as a targeting and a violencing and a dehumanizing of Jews because they're Jewish. But it isn't what is engaged in a political argument over what should be happening in a country, what should be happening to all of its inhabitants, that it cannot be used to make right the dehumanizing of one population, Palestinians, in order to raise up another and to advantage some Jews over the cause of others. That's not what we're about. JVP is very comfortable. It's interesting personally that I have never once, as I have been on the streets, as I have worked with Palestinian partners, found them to be targeting me. And in fact, some of the strongest voices being raised in those moments about separating anti-Semitism from pro-Palestinian work have been Palestinian voices who are in some extent feeling very much wronged by being put into the camp of being anti-Semites and Jew haters. It's not who they are, but they are defenders of their own dignity. And we can put arm in arm around that and stand up to say those who are doing this are not being anti-Semites. I've been very proud in the work we did to support Chicago's ceasefire ordinance to stand with Palestinian partners and say, and turn to my Jewish friends and say, all of this work is not about Jew hating. All of this is trying to say they and we, Jews and Palestinians, have a common reason to say killing, murdering in the name of one people is not right. So I hope that gives you a sense of this. I'd be glad to talk further about that if people would like, and dialogue a little bit more. But I think it is. about
I was going to say, Marty,
it.
and I think
There's
that might come up in questions and answers where people might
super.
have, which we'll be moving into shortly. People may have more questions. One thing that really struck me just now when you were sharing was how you could feel the unity with the Jewish people and the Palestinians, even as you protest together. Because one of the things that struck me most listening to some of the rabbis on Jewish Voice for Peace was how before the state of Israel was created, the Jews and Palestinians lived in harmony. They babysat each other's children. There was this same solidarity that you're experiencing
One of
now.
the saddest moments, Mark, in my personal journey, one of my family's close friends, a generation older than me, was a gentleman who was a survivor of the Holocaust, had fled as a teenager from Salonika, Greece, lived his life in Israel. And as we visited with Jackie, he would often have us visit his Palestinian friend, a jeweler whose shop was in the old city, in the shuk in the old city. And I remember one morning we were sitting having tea with Abed and Jackie, my wife and I, talking about my wife's father, who was a very close friend of both of the men. And the two men were sharing stories of their own family who had shared lots of life experiences, the key life moments, and who were now, and this was several years ago, and who were now really glum over the fact that their children, because of the way the politics had emerged, could not have the same relationship with them. And in fact, in some ways it would be hard even for them to visit because of the walls and now this is even worse. So this is the life on the ground had moments when Jew and Palestinian in Israel could together be there. There are, in the modern terms, there are Palestinian Jewish citizens who are unable to speak now because their voices are being silenced and no longer held valid in that nation. This is not about protecting Jewish life. This is how this is now about protecting Jewish supremacy.
Wow. Thanks so much for sharing that information and the personal example there. And Marty, I have one more question that we had prepared in advance before we turn it over to attendees. So we're aware of our American Friends Service Committee, the Apartheid Free Initiative, and our pledge. But are there other campaigns going on or other resources that you would recommend to us, just in addition to our this Apartheid Free Initiative that we have?
Yeah, much of I'm leaving you with this last thing just to give you a sense of some of the sort of written resources which might help people give you some background, and please share these. Each of these are linked to a point, and including to JVP's national web presence. A lot of our focus in the last 6 months, unfortunately, has been on two very immediate efforts. So anywhere you can link into the call for an immediate ceasefire, which clearly we'd love to see coupled with a release of hostages. But the killing on the ground right now, the destruction of a whole people, 2 million people living in Gaza, would really be appreciated. And you can do that by calling whoever your national representative is to the Congress and asking them to add their voice to. There is a sign-on letter in the Congress asking your senators to do that. And as of now, most of the Illinois delegation has not done that. As this continues, any opportunity you individually and collectively can have to be asking the United States government to stop shipping over more and more military equipment right now, so that those bombs can be dropped and those bullets can be fired, would really be appreciated. Depending on where you live, you're pressing local governments to add their names to a growing number of local governments who have taken action, like Chicago did, to say, we call for a ceasefire. All of that's important. And to the extent those voices get louder and louder, that's helpful. That's going to create the space and the room actually for the ongoing effort to bring sanity to the region and create an enduring end to the occupation and the apartheid, and create a future which Jewish Israelis, Palestinian Israelis, Palestinian Palestinians really have a future that isn't terrible. So those are the kinds of things JVP will be launching. We were about to do this before the immediacy of the moment took place, to add to the pressure by an effort to push state and local governments to invest from their investments in Israel bonds. You may or may not be aware, for those of you who are Illinois residents, that Illinois is I think the third largest buyer as a state government of Israeli investments. And in fact, right after 10/7, bought another $10 million of Israeli government bonds. And we would like to press and invite all of the support we can get for this, the Illinois government, to really stop doing that. It doesn't help bring peace. It fuels a war machine. And as much as people may feel they're making a statement of support, they're actually supporting a government which is hell-bent on a military solution to something which is not a military problem. It's a political problem that needs a different kind of solution. So those are the kind of immediate actions I clearly invite people to join us on.
Thanks a lot, Marty, for sharing those immediate actions and these resources. Thank you very much. If it's all right with you at this point, I would like to turn it over to Sue Steyer, who is going to take questions for you to answer from attendees.
Marcia?
Marty, can you help us understand a little bit more about Israeli culture? I know that not all Israelis are Jews. That, in fact, 20%, as I've read, are Arabs. Are those Arabs Palestinians? Help us sort out the ethnic and cultural mix within Israel.
So you're correct about the rough population numbers. About 20% of the population are non-Jews. Now, they are made up of a number of communities. Some are Muslim by religion and identify as Palestinian. Although I would say that that's a difficult identification for someone, and to some extent a personally brave and risky identification to have, because within the politic of Israel, even displaying a Palestinian flag is considered to be treasonous. And I guess the best example I would give you actually would be today. In the world today, the Palestinian community is celebrating Nakba Day. And if you're not familiar with that, Nakba Day, Nakba being the tragedy, is the day they commemorate the expulsion of 750,000 Palestinians at the beginning and the formation of the Israeli nation. Many of those are in fact either the still living or the children of people living in Gaza, many of whom, that's where many were displaced. Many are the people living in the Palestinian territories. Their homes were in Israel. So today is a day which that nation is commemorating that. In Israel itself, it's considered treasonous to actually, there was a teacher who has been called on the carpet today for mentioning that within their teaching lessons. So that's so when I say who sees themselves as Palestinian, a harder question to answer. Some of them are Druze. Druze is a small religious community, different, not Muslim. There are their own religious structure, somewhat of a mystical religion, and they live mostly within the northern communities in Israel. Some of them have fought and are recognized within the Israeli army. Some have not, but they are a community unto themselves. Some of the non-Jewish citizens of Israel are Christian and live within a series of church communities. Some, and if you're in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, that church has a number of areas under the guidance of different church communities. Some of which relate back to Eastern Rite churches in Greece and other parts of the country. Some of them are connected to churches that have roots in Egypt, the Coptic Church particularly. And then there are Bedouin communities whose tradition is different than Palestinian traditions. Those were nomadic communities, farming and herding communities, struggling to figure out how to live in a modern state. So it's a very diverse community. The one thing the non-Jewish communities, and particularly the Palestinian and Muslim-rooted communities, are that religiously and culturally, they are less and less seen as the government passed several years ago what they called a Jewish state law, which made Jewish Israelis a prominent and more advantaged community, and diminished the stake of non-Jewish communities in the state. The other comment I'd make, I as a Jew, if I wish to claim it, could tomorrow get on a plane, fly into Ben Gurion Airport, get off the plane, raise my hand and say, I want to be a citizen. And I would be immediately granted citizenship on the basis of I could demonstrate I have a Jewish ancestry, have lived a Jewish religious life, have Jewish roots, I'm a citizen. Palestinians who can trace a history back of hundreds of years to saying my grandfather lived in what is today Haifa, or in the outskirts of Tel Aviv, or in other communities. In fact, I could point to the house in Israel where my parents or grandparents lived, have no right to come back or bring back ancestral home. And you have currently going on the dispossession of families who were Palestinian families who were originally rooted in homes in the territorial 1948 boundaries of Israel, who were evicted in 48, who were part of that 750,000 population who was dispossessed, who are now living in East Jerusalem homes that they were allowed to take on after they were dispossessed, who are being thrown out of their homes because that home they were dispossessed to might have been a Jewish home, but are not allowed to raise their hand and say, well, if you're reclaiming that home because of its original Jewish ownership, give me back my home in Yaffo or in Tel Aviv, that was my parents' home. They're not allowed to reclaim them. So there really is a very difficult cultural reality that makes being Palestinian not the same as being a Jew in Israel. That's the confrontation I personally began to live with and say I couldn't claim any longer. It's not speaking for me as a Jew. Does that give you a sense, Marcia? Thank you.
Elizabeth.
Hi there. Thanks very much for sharing your, your experience and your time tonight. I've been trying to be articulate with this question, and I don't know that I've actually gotten there. But one of the things that I've noticed when I communicate with my elected officials is that communicating with them on the issue, on these issues, the invasion of Palestine and everything around it, just like since October. Imagine anything any of us could have communicated about with our elected officials. My experience is that their response on these issues is completely different than response that I've gotten in the last, 10, 15, 20 years of writing to my electeds on various things. What I found is silence. I feel like my elected officials here, I live in Evanston, Illinois, and boy, they're very, very progressive. They're some of the most progressive people in the House and Senate. Nothing. And that's been a big wake-up call for me. And so I wonder, like, how in your experience does one sort of break through that wall? I understand why the wall is there. I get it. I get that we're sending Israel like billions and billions and billions. We're funding the war. I get that. I'm not naive. But I also feel like the usual and customary ways of communicating concern, questions, and voting intentions, frankly, are not working when it comes to this question. That's been my experience. I don't know if it's anyone else's experience. And I don't even know if I've been articulate enough with a question, but
No, I Elizabeth, was and still am a constituent of Jan Schakowsky.
there you go.
I have a long personal relationship that goes back to her first run for state representative as an office. So
Yeah, actually, I do too.
and to the extent that she and I have cell phone numbers of each other, and she's called me to yell at me when some of us sat in her one of her offices in town early on. She was angry. So I understand, and this is I'd say several things. One, there is a tremendous amount of political and financial might being put in to the Israel is always right argument. And there is a great fear, and I think I see it in the president's hemming and hawing, despite the fact that folks who helped him get office are telling him he's in the wrong place.
Yeah.
My only answer, I think, is that, and we are working as hard as we can, as I know our Palestinian partners, to raise the level of pressure on elected officials to say it's no longer acceptable to their constituency to remain silent. That it is, their vision that most of their constituency is comfortable with what this country is supporting, with the policies of our government, and with the silence on the kind of brutality that is in fact genocide is tolerable. And so I just, I'm encouraging as many voices as I said to really be picking up phones and saying, you may think it's a minority, it's not. The reason we could pass, despite all of the political pressure, a ceasefire resolution in Chicago is the amount of industry organizing that went on from a really diverse coalition of Palestinian and Jewish and Christian voices who were in the streets and in the offices of Chicago older people, and saying together, asking for a ceasefire and voting for it is something you must do. And I think the political wisdom until we won that battle was that that was not going to happen. And I think that the voices you're fighting, Elizabeth, are really being challenged now. The reason that there's so much yelling about anti-Semitism, as opposed to just Israel is a great modern liberal democracy, is in fact a sign of how strong the pressure has become. In my mind, the loud screaming is the tell, if you will, that there is in fact worry that Israel's story of being the bastion of democracy is in fact being debunked, and so they need something else. And anti-Semitism is seen to be the ultimate trump card. How can you fight against that? Well, I'm here to say, as a Jew, as a practicing Jew, and as somebody who's devoted my life to a Jewish community, that ain't so. And we can all together be fighting for human dignity, and for a world that's not the one that's being put forward. I hope that helps.
Thank you.
Okay, Mark of Janet and Elaine and Mark.
So thank you very much, Marty, for your dedicated work through the decades, and very admirable. One of the things that bothers me the most is that Israel has chosen to have a military occupation of the West Bank. And in addition to the military occupation, they have allowed more than 500,000 Israeli citizens to live on that property. And I'm really at a loss as to how that de facto situation can be remedied to the satisfaction of multiple parties. And I was wondering if you have any notions of how that came about and what to do about it.
Well, it came about because one, the Israeli government, even those that have been viewed as liberal or more progressive than the current government, were never committed to recognizing the reality that there is another people with a claim also parallel to the Jewish claim to this land. And so, you have not heard an Israeli government for decades actually talk about the need for a parallel independent state. The concept which many people in this country keep holding up of two-state solution, if there ever was a reality to that, died years ago. And so if I have a personal vision any longer, and it's shared, by many, and it's to some extent not mine to dictate, is that it is more likely we're going to end up with something that recognizes the religious community's needs for its religious roots, but as a state recognizes the political rights in a broader geography. It occurred in part right after 67, when there was an almost messianic belief that the win in that war, the conquering of those lands, was the fulfillment of a biblical promise. And the folks who established the beginning settlements were all reclaiming land that they believed God gave them. And they acted on that, and politically they were able to very quietly, and more recently not so quietly, convince or blackmail the government, because they controlled enough seats in a coalition reality to allow them to expand those settlements. You also had a military leadership back to Prime Minister Dayan, Moshe Dayan, the hero of 67, who believed setting those up were in the security interests of the state, and therefore because they would ring a population with another population. And that's been carried forward. It is a political, beyond the religious belief, which you and I may differ with. I recognize why it's there. It had a political interest. And so you now have exactly what South Africa did. You create these little enclaves, ring them with Jewish population, create roads, which only Jews are allowed to drive on, create checkpoints to control a population. And as long as you're allowed by an international order to not see those people as equal, not see the deprivation of their political and human rights as actually a crime, then you can get away with it. And I think the reason that list of organizations, and hopefully you individually and collectively use the word apartheid and sign on to that, is because that answers the question that that's not possible any longer. Now, if you don't want, as a Israeli Jewish community, to create a larger entity, if you want to dialogue with your Palestinian co-residents about could partition be possible, and those communities could together reach a way to do that, move Jews and Palestinian population. It's not mine to dictate, no, you cannot do that. But unless together the two peoples agree to move people, the only solution in my mind is a reality, which is in fact a river to the sea reality, which says all of us, Jew, Palestinian, Christian, are co-equal. There is a democracy. You have a government which is, as in this country, elected one man, one vote, one woman, one vote. You then figure out how to protect the interests of all that. Is that easy? Is that going to be painless? No, there are people on both sides who will struggle with that. But that's the only future I think I see as possible right now. But I don't know if others see it differently. And I'm right now not living there. And I'm not Palestinian. I'm not a Jewish Israeli. Those folks are going to have to do the harder work of figuring out a future that respects that human dignity. My Palestinian partners here talk in those terms when we talk. Not all. There are voices in every community, but that's not the majority of any community. And I still have hope that that future is in fact in front of us if we stop screaming at each other, and more and more of this country gets together to say we don't want to pay the cost of that war. That's not in any of our interests.
The next question, Mark Massey.
Marty, this kind of goes along with Elizabeth's a little bit, in the sense that in addition to reaching out to political officials, another way to get attention is through protests. both legal protests, civil disobedience, whatever. I'm just wondering, and I love when I see the Orthodox rabbis at the protests with the signs. I don't know, it just like hits me in some way. But I guess my question to you is, do you feel like at this point protests are more powerful than how do they fit into in terms of a way to get the message across, or is it all equally important? If you could just speak a little bit to the idea of demonstrations.
I think what demonstrations right now are trying to heighten the reality that large numbers of folks in our community here, in our community as an American diverse community, are not supportive of a U.S. policy that is putting, I understand we're throwing another $1 billion of bombs and bullets in the pipeline as of the last night. And it is important. I think one of the reasons this has become such a hot political issue is the amount of protesting that has gone on. And it's been with voices that are not just Palestinian voices. And that's important. I think that you as a community being on the front lines adds to that. Allies in the Christian church community and in the Black community and in the Hispanic community being on the line alongside us has been important. And the fact is that it has become much more of a multicultural, very diverse community in the streets. And you've seen that in the campus protests. I spent some time on the Northwestern campus. Some of my colleagues have been very engaged with the folks in DePaul and at UFC. And those audiences are Palestinian, but they're incredibly diverse. They represent the real diversity of the U.S., and that's important. But the political work of convincing electeds that they must act differently is also important. And that's a slower, longer term. And I tend now to describe it, Mark, as if all of our street protests were successful and we actually had a real ceasefire, a hostage exchange, and we would still be left with the problem as it was before 10/7. And in fact, while I'm not one who has ever stood behind violence, I didn't in the moments, the high moments of anti-Vietnam protests. I didn't when I was on the campus of Columbia in those strike moments. I was not the arguer for let's be violent. But I also recognize that in a moment when the future seems so bleak, there are elements in a community of oppressed people who will, as Nelson Mandela did, think of violence as a tool. I might argue with him if he were and I was there, but I also recognize it has a place. But if we were successful, the ceasefire, we still have this bigger problem. We have millions and millions of displaced non-citizen Palestinians who have no rights, who do not have a place where their lives are considered equal to. And we have a U.S. government who has, by and large, even before today, stood quiet, has struggled to be a strong voice saying, we may be your friend, but we're a friend who's got to tell you you're wrong. And so I urge and I still work with our efforts to educate at every level of government electeds that their actions going forward become very critical. So I'm looking for both. I want some of each. I would love you to be in the streets. I'd love you to be supporting the encampments and giving them political cover, which, my young colleagues need, but I also want you to be calling, Jan Schakowsky and her peers, and saying, Jan, you're wrong. You need to be more outspoken right now, and you need to vote differently. And you need to know that it's not just an issue which you can ignore. So yeah, I hope, Mark, that gives you a sense of, at least from my perspective, where we are.
Yeah, it did very much. Thank you.
Well, Marty, thank you so much. Your explanations were clear. They were easy to follow. Your personal stories were really helpful. So
Thank you.
thank
And
you
let me,
so
as
much.
I said to Mark at the beginning, if there are folks who, after this evening, want to raise some additional questions or have some stuff they want to talk about in terms of both anti-Semitism and what you're hearing in this broad effort to bar us, I'm available. The email, you guys know how to reach me, and I'm more than happy to continue a dialogue one-on-one or in small groups. And the resources that are in that last slide, please use them. And if there's more you need, we're available. So thank you. I hope I've been helpful to you figuring it out. Take care. Good night, all. I'm going to drop off and wish you all a good evening.